In 351 before Christ, the citizens of Sidon barred their gates against the largest army in the Persian Empire, and when those gates finally broke, they set fire to their own city rather than kneel. Ancient sources claim 40,000 burned. The archaeological record confirms it. A charred destruction layer, vitrified mud brick, carbonized cedar beams sealed beneath centuries of rebuilding. Yet within a generation, Sidon was minting coins again, launching ships again, blowing glass that would travel to the edges of the known world. How does a city burn to ash and rise, not once but across 4,000 years of continuous habitation, on the same narrow promontory between mountain and sea? This is the complete story of Sidon, not a fragment, not a single golden age frozen in amber. You are about to walk through the entire life of one of humanity's oldest continuously inhabited port cities, from the first Chalcolithic settlers who recognized the extraordinary gift of a double harbour, sheltered from storms in every season, fed by freshwater springs rising through limestone, backed by cedar forests that the ancient world would kill to possess. You will witness the first timber ships loading resin-sealed logs bound for Egypt in the 3rd millennium before Christ. You will read the desperate letters of King Zimrida to the pharaoh as empires collided overhead. You will stand in the crushing yards where millions of murex shells were smashed open to extract drops of purple pigment worth more than silver. You will enter the Temple of Eshmun on its terraced hillside, where marble thrones and sculpted friezes blended the art of Egypt, Persia, and Greece into something entirely Sidonian. You will descend into painted underground tombs where the dead gazed up at frescoed ceilings for 2,000 years in silence. And you will follow the archaeologists, from Ernest Renan in 1860 to the rescue excavations of today, as they cut through Ottoman, Crusader, Roman, and Hellenistic layers to reach the Phoenician bedrock of a city that never stopped being lived in. This matters because Sidon did not merely exist. It transmitted. The purple dye born in its coastal vats colored the robes of kings from Nineveh to Rome and gave an entire people their Greek name, Phoenicians, the purple people. Its craftsmen, according to biblical tradition, built the Temple of Solomon. Its glassblowers may have invented the technique of inflating molten glass on the end of a hollow pipe, a revolution that put transparent vessels into ordinary hands across the Mediterranean. Its philosopher Zeno led the Epicurean school in Athens. Its alphabet, shared with its sister cities, became the ancestor of every script you have ever read. And yet the deepest layers of Sidon remain unexcavated, sealed beneath a living Lebanese city of 200,000 souls. What we know is extraordinary. What remains buried may rewrite chapters of human history we thought were settled. If you find yourself drawn to complete journeys through the great cities of the ancient world, told from first settlement to final excavation trench, consider subscribing. Each film brings back to life a world built in ashlar stone, cedar wood, and molten glass, one city at a time. Now let us begin where every story of Sidon must begin, with the sea, the springs, and the narrow strip of earth where someone, more than 6,000 years ago, looked at a sheltered cove and understood that this was the place to build. The sea arrives from the west in long, rolling swells that have crossed the open Mediterranean without interruption, and where they meet this coast, they find something rare, a low promontory of sandstone and limestone jutting just far enough into the water to break the force of the waves on both sides. To the north of this headland, a shallow basin forms where the seafloor rises gently, creating an anchorage sheltered from the prevailing southwesterly storms. To the south, a second basin opens, protected from the northern gales of winter. This double harbour, one for each wind, is the geographic fact upon which everything that follows will be built. A ship caught in foul weather from any quarter can find calm water here. In an age when vessels are hauled ashore each night and every landing is a negotiation with the surf, this is not a convenience. It is a gift of stone and current that determines the fate of peoples. Behind the promontory, freshwater springs rise through fractures in the limestone bedrock, fed by rainfall percolating down from the mountains that loom to the east. The Lebanon Range climbs steeply from the coastal plain, its western slopes dense with forest, cedar, cypress, juniper, and pine, timber that the ancient world will covet for temple beams and ship keels for 3,000 years. The plain itself is narrow, pressed between mountain and sea, but its red soil is deep and well watered. Grain grows here, olives ripen, fig trees root in the terraced hillsides. Sometime in the 5th millennium before the Common Era, people settle on this promontory. They are not the first to walk this coast, but they are the first whose traces survive in the compacted earth beneath what will become a great city. Their presence is known from fragments, dark burnished pottery sherds, flint blades with the distinctive retouch of Chalcolithic tool-making traditions, ash lenses from cooking fires pressed into layers of sandy clay. These earliest occupation deposits lie many meters below the modern street level, reached only where construction trenches or rescue excavations have cut deep enough to touch virgin soil. By the 4th millennium, the settlement thickens. More pottery appears, handmade vessels with combed and incised decoration, storage jars whose capacity suggests surplus, suggests trade. The springs provide reliable fresh water even in the driest summers. The harbour basins, shaped by the slow geological work of wave erosion on softer rock strata and the protective arm of the headland, are already functioning as natural anchorages for whatever craft these early mariners possess. Dugouts, reed boats, perhaps the first planked hulls lashed with cord. The earliest trade connections reach inland along river valleys toward Syria and south along the coast toward the Nile Delta. Resin and timber move in one direction. Egyptian stone vessels and prestige goods arrive in return. The logic is already legible in the 4th millennium. This place sits at the intersection of mountain resources and maritime routes, a hinge between the interior world of grain and livestock and the exterior world of sea lanes and distant markets. The promontory accumulates. Each generation builds atop the compressed debris of the last. Floors over ash, walls over rubble, the slow vertical growth that archaeologists read like pages. By the end of the 4th millennium, the settlement has become permanent, stratified, connected. It is not yet a city. It has no walls that survive in the record, no monumental architecture, no written name. But the geographic logic is already complete. The double harbour, the springs, the timber mountains, the fertile strip of coast. These will not change. Everything that Sidon becomes across the next 4,000 years is already encoded in the shape of this headland and the depth of this anchorage, in the fresh water rising cold through limestone, in the dark forests climbing the slopes above. The 3rd millennium before the Common Era opens with the settlement already rooted, already trading, already watching the horizon for sails. But now the pace quickens. What had been a fishing village with seasonal exchange becomes something more deliberate. A port with infrastructure, a place where timber descends from the mountains on a schedule, where ships are expected and berths prepared. The harbour basins deepen not by nature alone, but by human intention. Stone quays begin to define the shoreline, rough-cut blocks of local sandstone laid against the natural rock shelf to create level surfaces where cargo can be stacked and rolled. The northern harbour, sheltered from the prevailing southwest winds, becomes the primary anchorage. Vessels of the early 3rd millennium are modest, broad-beamed sailing craft with single masts and sewn plank hulls, capable of hugging the coast from the Nile Delta to the timber ports of the Levant. They come for cedar. Egypt's need for long, straight timber is insatiable. The Nile Valley grows no trees suitable for temple roofing, shipbuilding, or coffin construction. The forests of Lebanon, visible from Sidon as a dark band above the foothills, hold precisely what the pharaohs require. Cedar logs, some exceeding 20 meters, are felled in the high valleys, dragged down seasonal watercourses, and assembled at the coast. Sidon's harbour becomes a staging ground for this trade. Alongside the timber moves resin, aromatic conifer sap used in Egyptian mummification, incense, and waterproofing. Jars of golden resin, sealed with clay stoppers, appear in the archaeological record of both shores. By the middle of the 3rd millennium, the settlement has grown vertically and laterally. Mud brick domestic structures, their foundations set on stone footings to resist the damp coastal air, crowd the promontory. Streets are narrow, unpaved, running between walls that retain the heat of summer and channel winter rain toward cisterns. The material culture shows increasing Egyptian contact. Fragments of alabaster vessels, faience beads, and copper tools of Nilotic origin appear in Sidonian strata of this period. The Egyptian execration texts, dating to the early 2nd millennium, provide the first written references to Sidon by name, inscribed on pottery vessels or clay figurines meant to be ritually smashed, cursing potential enemies of the pharaoh. That Sidon appears in these texts confirms its political visibility to the Egyptian court. It is a place worth naming, worth fearing, worth controlling through magic if not through arms. The Middle Bronze Age, roughly 1800 to 1550 before the Common Era, brings fortification. Massive earthen ramparts faced with stone glacis, the characteristic defensive architecture of Canaanite cities in this period, encircle the settlement. These are not walls against casual raiders, but engineered defenses against organized siege. The city within has grown dense enough, wealthy enough to require such protection. Warehouses near the harbour store, amphorae of oil and wine alongside bundled textiles. Copper ingots arrive from Cyprus. Egyptian scarabs and amulets circulate as prestige goods and diplomatic tokens. The harbour itself has become a complex operation. Timber must be sorted, measured, and loaded onto vessels whose capacity is calculated in advance. Resin must be collected, heated, filtered, and sealed. Ships require maintenance, hull caulking with bitumen, sail repair, rope replacement. A class of specialized workers emerges: stevedores, shipwrights, rope makers, pitch boilers. The smell of the working harbour is tar and sawdust and salt. The sound is mallet on wood and the creak of loaded hulls settling against stone. By 1550 before the Common Era, When Egypt's new kingdom pharaohs begin their imperial expansion into the Levant, Sidon is no longer a village that trades. It is a fortified port city with a royal authority, a harbour infrastructure capable of handling the timber fleets, and a population dense enough to fill the space within its ramparts. It has entered the written record of the great powers. It has walls. It has a name that pharaohs inscribe in clay and break in ritual fury. The first harbour is complete, not merely as a physical basin of sheltered water, but as an economic system, a node in a network that stretches from the cedar forests above to the temple construction sites of Thebes and Memphis below. The mountains give their wood, the sea carries it south, and Sidon, perched between the two, grows rich on the transaction. The pharaohs of the 18th dynasty do not merely trade with the Levantine coast, they claim it. Thutmose III marches north in the mid-15th century before the Common Era, and the cities of Canaan, Sidon among them, enter a new political reality. They become vassals. Their kings still rule, still collect harbour tolls, still oversee the loading of cedar onto Egyptian-bound ships. But now they do so under oath, bound by treaty to a distant throne on the Nile. Egyptian garrison commanders appear in the region. Egyptian goods, scarabs, faience amulets, alabaster vessels, flow into Sidonian households, not merely as trade items, but as tokens of allegiance, markers of a relationship that is at once commercial and imperial. For nearly 2 centuries this system holds. The coastal cities pay tribute in timber, copper, textiles, and grain. In return they receive protection, or at least the promise of it, against rivals and raiders. The palace economy of the Late Bronze Age connects Sidon to a vast web of diplomatic exchange linking Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mitanni, Babylon, Assyria, and Cyprus. Cuneiform becomes the language of international correspondence. Even a Canaanite king on the Lebanese coast must dictate his letters in Akkadian, pressing wedge-shaped signs into damp clay tablets that will travel south by messenger to the pharaoh's archive. It is in this archive, discovered at Tel El Amarna in Egypt in 1887, that Sidon's voice survives from the 14th century before the Common Era. A king named Zimrida writes to the pharaoh. His letter, catalogued as EO 144, is brief, formal, anxious. He prostrates himself 7 times and 7 times more. He reports on the movements of enemies. He asks for help. The tone is that of a loyal vassal caught between powerful neighbors, particularly the aggressive expansion of Abdi Ashirta and his son Aziru, rulers of Amuru in the hinterland, who threaten the coastal cities from the east. Zimrida's Sidon is not isolated. It exists within a constellation of competing city-states, Byblos, Tyre, Beirut, Akko, each writing its own desperate letters to a pharaoh who responds slowly, or not at all. The harbour in this period is fortified and active. Egyptian administrative texts list Sidon among the ports supplying the imperial network. Ships carry not only timber, but also purple-dyed wool, olive oil, and wine in Canaanite storage jars, whose distinctive shape appears in shipwrecks across the eastern Mediterranean. The Uluburun wreck, sunk off the Turkish coast around 1300 before the Common Era, carries cargo that could have loaded at a port exactly like Sidon: copper ingots, glass ingots, ebony logs, ivory, and jars of terebinth resin. Then the system breaks. Around 1200 before the Common Era, the interconnected palace economies collapse in rapid succession. The Hittite Empire falls, Ugarit burns, Mycenaean Greece fragments, Egypt withdraws behind its borders. The causes remain debated: drought, famine, disrupted trade routes, internal revolt, the migrations of peoples the Egyptians call the Sea Peoples. Destruction layers appear at sites across the Levant. Cities that had flourished for centuries are abandoned overnight. Sidon does not die. The archaeological record beneath the modern city shows no clean break, no total destruction horizon matching those found at Ugarit or Hattusa. The harbour remains occupied. The settlement continues. Perhaps the double anchorage, the freshwater springs, the defensible promontory, the same geographic logic that first drew settlers here, now saves the city from annihilation. Perhaps Sidon's rulers negotiate, submit, adapt, as Zimrida once adapted to Egyptian power. The transition is not painless. Trade networks contract, Egyptian prestige goods vanish from the material record. The cuneiform tablet gives way to silence. But the silence is not death, it is transformation. Beneath it, Sidon is gathering strength for what comes next. The age when no empire stands above the Phoenician cities, and the sea belongs to whoever dares to sail it. And so the sea belongs to Sidon. The great palaces of the Bronze Age world lie in ashes. Mycenae contracts behind its cyclopean walls. Hattusa stands empty on the Anatolian plateau. The Egyptian empire retreats behind the delta. The international system that once moved cedar and copper and lapis lazuli along royal networks, guaranteed by pharaonic seals and Hittite treaties, has dissolved. In its place, open water, ungoverned and immense, waiting for whoever possesses the ships, the skill, and the nerve to cross it. Sidon possesses all three. The 12th and 11th centuries before the Common Era see the city not merely survive, but expand. The harbour basins, north and south, shelter a growing fleet of merchant vessels. Broad-beamed cargo ships with high sterns and single square sails, built from the cedar and cypress still hauled down from the Lebanon range. The shipwrights work the promontory's shore, their adzes shaping keels from timber that no other coast in the eastern Mediterranean can match. And in the workshops behind the harbour, a revolution in commerce is underway, one measured not in metal or grain, but in colour. The murex industry defines Phoenician Sidon. Along the shoreline, archaeological excavation has revealed massive middens of crushed shells, the remains of Bolinus brandaris and Hexaplex trunculus, spiny shelled sea snails harvested by the tens of thousands from the rocky shallows. Each animal yields only a few drops of mucus from a small hypobranchial gland. The mucus is extracted, collected in stone vats, mixed with salt, and left to steep for 3 days. Then it is slowly heated, never boiled, in water for 10 days or more, the liquid reducing to a concentrated dye bath. The stench is extraordinary. Ancient sources describe it as unbearable, a rotting, sulphurous reek that clings to the workers, the vats, the surrounding streets. The dye quarter sits downwind from the residential areas for good reason, but the result is magnificent. Textiles dipped in this liquid emerge in shades ranging from deep violet to reddish purple, depending on species, exposure to sunlight, and the precise chemistry of reduction. The color does not fade, it deepens with washing and wear. No other dye in the ancient world achieves this permanence, this luminous saturation. The cloth becomes worth its weight in silver. Kings and priests across the Near East and the Aegean will pay staggering sums for Sidonian purple. The Greeks will eventually name this entire coast for the color. Phoenike, the land of purple, becomes Phoenicia, and the name endures for millennia. It is a merchant's identity, not a king's, and it fits. Sidon in this era is not an imperial capital. It is a commercial engine, its wealth built on dye vats and cargo holds rather than conquest. Homer, composing centuries later but drawing on traditions rooted in this period, calls Sidonian work the finest in the world. In the Iliad, a silver mixing bowl crafted by Sidonians is declared the most beautiful object on earth. Sidonian textiles appear as royal gifts, prizes worthy of heroes. These are not casual references. They preserve the memory of an age when Sidonian craftsmanship set the standard across the Mediterranean. The harbour expands to meet the demand. New quay walls are constructed from dressed sandstone blocks, extending the usable anchorage. Warehouses multiply along the waterfront. The material record of early Iron Age Sidon shows increasing quantities of imported Cypriot pottery, Egyptian faience, and Aegean goods, evidence that trade routes once controlled by palatial bureaucracies are now operated by independent Sidonian merchants sailing under their own authority. The city's population grows, the promontory fills, streets narrow between mud-brick houses roofed with cedar beams. The smell of the dye works mingles with wood smoke, brine, and the oil of pressed olives. Fishermen bring in the murex catch at dawn. Weavers stretch undyed wool on wooden frames. The purple cloth, folded and sealed, is loaded aboard ships bound for destinations that grow more distant with each generation. Cyprus, Rhodes, Crete, and beyond, westward into waters that the Bronze Age palace kingdoms never mastered. No single king commands this expansion. No imperial decree drives it. The energy comes from the harbour itself, from the accumulated knowledge of currents and coastlines, from the dye vats whose stench means wealth, from a city that has learned the most essential lesson of the post-collapse world, that the sea rewards those who move and ruins those who wait. By the 10th century before the Common Era, the reputation precedes the cargo. When foreign kings seek the finest work in the ancient world, ivory carved so thin that light passes through it, bronze hammered into scenes of gods and lions, glass drawn into beads of cobalt and turquoise, they send to Sidon. The city's workshops have become the measure against which all craftsmanship is judged. The artisan quarters press close behind the harbour, a dense labyrinth of narrow lanes where the sound of copper mallets rings from dawn until the light fails. In one workshop, an ivory carver bends over a hippopotamus tusk imported from Egypt, scoring the surface with a bronze graver, coaxing from the creamy material a panel of sphinxes and lotus blossoms destined to ornament a throne in some distant palace. In another, a bronze smith pours molten metal into a clay mold, producing a shallow bowl whose interior will be chased with concentric registers, a pharaoh smiting enemies in the Egyptian style, winged genii in the Assyrian manner, all rendered with a fluency that belongs to neither tradition alone but to Sidon's own synthesis. These are the objects that will travel farthest. Sidonian bronze bowls and ivory panels appear in the archaeological record at Nimrud, in the Assyrian heartland, where they were collected as tribute or trade goods and stored in the palaces of kings who coveted what Sidonian hands could make. Glass, too, emerges from these workshops, not yet blown, for that revolution lies centuries ahead, but core-formed and cast. Small vessels of opaque blue and white glass, perfume flasks and cosmetic containers leave Sidon aboard the same ships that carry purple cloth. Glass beads strung on linen thread become currency of diplomacy and desire across the Mediterranean. The biblical tradition preserves a memory of this supremacy. The first book of Kings records that Solomon, building his temple in Jerusalem, sent to the Phoenician coast for skilled workers, men who knew how to cut cedar, quarry stone, and cast bronze pillars of extraordinary scale. The text names Hiram of Tyre as Solomon's partner, yet the broader tradition consistently calls the coastal peoples Sidonians, a usage so entrenched that it serves as a collective name for all Phoenicians in Hebrew scripture. The craftsmen who cast the twin bronze pillars Jachin and Boaz, who carved the cherubim of olive wood overlaid with gold, who panelled the inner sanctuary with cedar, these men carried skills perfected in Sidonian workshops across generations. Sidon and Tyre in this era exist in a complex kinship, rivals, partners, sometimes ruled by the same dynastic house. Ethbal, priest of Astarte, who seizes the Sidonian throne in the mid-9th century, extends his influence over both cities. His daughter Jezebel marries King Ahab of Israel, carrying Sidonian religion and culture deep into the Levantine interior. The dynasty demonstrates that Sidon's power in this period is not merely commercial, but political, projecting itself through marriage alliance, religious prestige, and artisanal monopoly. The city itself grows denser, wealthier, more layered. The harbour quays are rebuilt in fitted ashlar masonry. Warehouses multiply along the waterfront. The temple precincts receive votive offerings of increasing refinement, terracotta figurines, faience amulets, carved bone. The sacred enclosures of Astarte and Eshmun accumulate the devotion of merchants who have crossed dangerous waters and returned whole. Incense smoke rises from altars fed with Arabian frankincense that arrived by caravan through the interior and reached the coast at Sidon's markets. What distinguishes this century is not conquest, but influence, a soft empire of skill, taste, and irreplaceable knowledge. Sidon does not march armies inland. It sends craftsmen, and those craftsmen reshape the visual world of kingdoms from the Nile to the Tigris. The ivories found smashed in Nimrod's ruins, the bronze bowls recovered from Etruscan tombs in Italy, the glass beads unearthed in Greek sanctuaries, all testify to a city whose workshops operated as the creative engine of the early first millennium, producing luxury goods that defined what power looked like across the ancient Near East and beyond. The dynasty that rules Sidon through these centuries does not merely govern a city. It governs a legacy, and it guards that legacy with stone, inscription, and curse. Beneath the southern slopes outside the walls, deep shaft tombs cut vertically into the limestone bedrock receive the kings of Sidon in darkness, sealed chambers where carved sarcophagi rest in silence, their lids inscribed with warnings so fierce they reach across millennia with undiminished force. The royal necropolis takes shape across generations. Ashmunazar I, priest king of Astarte and ruler of Sidon in the 6th century before the Common Era, establishes a dynastic tradition of monumental burial that his successors will amplify. His son Tabnit inherits both throne and priesthood, and when death claims him, His body is placed inside an Egyptian anthropoid sarcophagus of polished black stone, a coffin originally carved for an Egyptian general named Penptar, acquired through channels that speak to Sidon's deep connections with the Nile Valley. But Tabinet's people add something the Egyptian maker never intended. Across the lid, in 22 characters of the Phoenician alphabet, they chisel a curse of extraordinary venom. Whoever opens this coffin, the inscription warns, may have no seed among the living, no rest among the dead. The words are not metaphor. They are ritual technology, a spiritual barrier meant to outlast the stone itself. Tabinet's son Eshmunazar II ascends to the throne as a child and dies young, yet his sarcophagus carries the longest Phoenician royal inscription ever found, 22 lines detailing his building projects, his mother Amoashtart's regency, and his territorial claims. The text names temples built to Astarte and to Baal of Sidon, sanctuaries raised in the sacred precinct near the sea. It claims dominion over Dor and Joppa, cities far to the south along the Palestinian coast, granted to Sidon by the Lord of Kings, almost certainly the Persian emperor. And it closes with the same terrible imprecation: may the violator have no root below and no fruit above, no rest in the company of the shades. The sarcophagus of Eshmunazar II emerges from the earth in 1855, discovered by workers in the Magarat Abloun area south of Sidon. It travels to Paris, where it enters the Louvre and becomes the single most important document of Phoenician royal ideology. 32 years later, in 1887, Osman Hamdi Bey's excavations in the same necropolis yield Tabnet's coffin, the mummified body still partially preserved inside, the curse inscription intact above the silent face. What these tombs reveal is a monarchy that understood permanence as a theological project. The kings of Sidon did not build pyramids or towering monuments visible from the sea. They buried their claims underground, trusting the written word and the terror of divine punishment to protect what gold and walls could not. The Phoenician script itself, spare, consonantal, efficient, becomes the instrument of eternal authority. Each letter chiseled into basalt or marble carries legal force, territorial boundaries, temple dedications, genealogical legitimacy, and the sacred prohibition against disturbance. The shaft tombs descend 6, 8, sometimes 10 meters into living rock. At the bottom, chambers open laterally, their ceilings low, their air still. The sarcophagi rest on raised platforms, oriented toward the west, toward the sea, toward the setting sun, toward whatever realm the Sidonian dead were believed to inhabit. Around them, smaller objects accompany the journey: alabaster vessels, bronze mirrors, gold leaf pressed thin as breath. Above ground, the city thrives under Assyrian and then Babylonian pressure, paying tribute, adjusting, surviving. But below ground, in the cool permanence of cut stone, the kings speak only to eternity, and to anyone foolish enough to disturb their rest. 2 kilometers northeast of the city, where the Nar al-Awali descends from the Lebanon range and the valley narrows between limestone ridges, a spring emerges from the rock. The water is cold, clear, and constant, flowing even in the driest summers when coastal wells turn brackish. It is here, at the site known today as Bostan esh-Sheikh, that the kings of Sidon build their greatest sanctuary. The temple of Eshmun, god of healing, lord of renewal, the dying and rising deity whose sacred waters promise restoration to the sick and the desperate. The sanctuary takes shape over centuries. The earliest votive deposits date to the 7th century before the Common Era. Small terracotta figurines, crude but earnest, pressed into the earth near the spring source. But the monumental construction belongs to the 6th and 5th centuries, when King Eshmunazar II and then King Bodashtat transform the hillside into a terraced sacred precinct of extraordinary ambition. Massive podium walls of dressed sandstone ashlar rise in stepped platforms, each terrace broader than the one above, climbing the slope in a geometry that channels the eye upward toward the temple proper. Bodashtat's building inscription, carved in Phoenician on the podium blocks themselves, declares that he built this house for his lord Eshmun at the spring of Idal, naming the sacred water source that gives the entire complex its reason for being. The spring feeds a rectangular pool lined with cut stone, its overflow channeled through carved conduits that carry the sacred water across the lower terraces. Pilgrims descend to this pool. They bathe. They leave offerings, hundreds of votive statuettes depicting children, infants, swaddled babies, suggesting that healing rites here center on fertility, childbirth, and the survival of the young. The smell of the place is water on warm stone, incense from cedar resin burning in bronze bowls, the faint mineral tang of the spring itself. Above the pool terrace, the tribune of Eshmun rises, a monumental platform bearing a sculptural frieze that astonishes for its stylistic hybridity. Carved in marble, the frieze depicts a sacred procession, divine figures, and ritual scenes rendered in a style that blends Greek sculptural naturalism with Phoenician iconographic conventions. The bodies move with Hellenic grace. The symbols remain Levantine. Nearby, the marble throne of Astarte sits against a wall, a massive carved seat flanked by sphinxes, its armrests shaped as winged creatures, its back panel decorated with a female figure in Egyptian pose. Persian period mosaic floors, their tesserae forming geometric and floral patterns, cover portions of the upper terrace where priests perform rites invisible to the pilgrims below. This is not a single temple, but an accumulation of royal piety across 2 centuries. Each king adds a terrace, a wall, a chapel, a colonnade. The architectural vocabulary shifts with each generation. Egyptian cornices give way to Persian column bases give way to Greek Ionic capitals. Yet the sacred logic remains constant. Water descends from the mountain, passes through consecrated stone, and carries divine healing power to those who seek it. Maurice Dunant begins systematic excavation here in 1963, and the work continues for decades, revealing layer upon layer of construction, renovation, and offering deposit. The votive children number in the thousands. The inscriptions name kings otherwise lost to history. The sculptural fragments demonstrate that Phoenician art is not derivative but synthetic, deliberately gathering the visual languages of every empire that touches this coast and forging them into something that belongs only to Sidon. The sanctuary functions continuously from the 7th century through the Hellenistic period and beyond. Even as the city below burns and rebuilds, the spring flows, the pool fills, and the sick climb the valley road toward the terraces where stone and water promise what no physician can guarantee. When Cambyses marches his Persian armies into Egypt in 525, before the Common Era, he does not cross the Sinai alone. He crosses it with Sidonian ships guarding his flank, Sidonian pilots navigating the coastal shallows, Sidonian timber framing his supply transports. The city that has survived every collapse of the Bronze and Iron Ages now makes its most consequential calculation. It offers its fleet to the greatest land empire the world has ever known. In return, it receives something no Phoenician city has possessed in centuries: security, autonomy, and access to every market from the Indus to the Nile. The arrangement transforms Sidon. Under Achaemenid patronage, the city becomes the primary naval station of the Western Persian Empire. The double harbour expands. The northern basin, sheltered from winter storms, receives new stone quays capable of berthing war galleys 3 banks deep. Trireme sheds, long-roofed slipways angled down to the waterline, line the inner harbour, their timber frames housing vessels that can be launched within hours of a royal summons. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century, names the Sidonians as the finest sailors in the Persian fleet, superior even to the Egyptians and Cilicians. When Xerxes reviews his navy before the invasion of Greece in 480 before the Common Era, it is aboard a Sidonian vessel that the great king sits. At Salamis, Sidonian triremes hold the position of honor on the right wing. This military prestige translates into wealth of extraordinary concentration. The silver coinage minted by Sidonian kings in this period tells the story in miniature. Coins of Baal Shillam I, struck in the early 5th century, depict a war galley under full oar above a stylized sea, with the great king enthroned on the reverse. Later issues under Abdashtat show the galley before the walls of a fortified city, Sidon itself, rendered in silver no larger than a thumbnail. These coins circulate throughout the eastern Mediterranean, accepted as reliable currency from Cyprus to the Aegean. The royal quarter of the city rises in ashlar masonry of exceptional quality. Persian-influenced architectural elements appear: bull capital columns, stepped crenellations, glazed brick panels in the Achaemenid manner, blended with the local Phoenician tradition of dressed sandstone and cedar beam roofing. The palace compound overlooks the harbour, its upper terraces offering sight lines to both anchorage basins. Administrative buildings house the bureaucracy of a city-state that manages not only its own trade, but the logistical demands of an imperial fleet. The population swells. Estimates based on the urban footprint and harbour capacity suggest tens of thousands within the walls and immediate suburbs: sailors, shipwrights, caulkers, rope makers, sail weavers, bronze casters, forging ram fittings, timber merchants supplying Lebanese cedar for hulls and masts. The dye workshops continue their ancient work, but now the purple cloth travels under Persian safe conduct to markets as distant as Persepolis and Susa. Glass production intensifies. The temple treasury grows fat on tithes from maritime commerce. Yet this golden age rests on a single political premise: loyalty to the great king. The Sidonian kings rule as vassals, minting their own coins, commanding their own fleets, building their own temples, but always within the frame of Achaemenid authority. When that authority weakens, when Persian demands grow excessive or Persian protection proves hollow, the calculation that built this prosperity will demand recalculation. For now, through the 5th century and into the 4th, the arrangement holds. The harbour fills with grain ships and war galleys alike. The sound of adze on cedar plank carries across the water from dawn until dusk. Smoke rises from the bronze foundries where ram sheaths take shape. and on the silver coins passing hand to hand in every port from Sidon to Athens, the war galley rides its frozen wave, emblem of a city whose power floats on the sea and whose survival depends on knowing precisely when to row and for whom. The calculation finally breaks in 351 before the Common Era. The arrangement that sustained Sidon through a century and a half of Persian partnership, loyalty exchanged for autonomy, ships for sovereignty, collapses in a single season of fire. The causes accumulate through the decade preceding the revolt. Artaxerxes III, called Oxus, presses the Phoenician cities harder than his predecessors. Levies grow heavier. The fleet demands intensify as Persia attempts to reconquer Egypt. Sidon's king Tennis reads the shifting winds, Egypt resists, Cyprus rebels, and the satraps of the western provinces waver in their allegiance. A coalition forms. Tennis secures Egyptian mercenary support, perhaps 4,000 Greek soldiers under the general mentor of Rhodes. The Sidonians expel their Persian garrison, tear down the royal paradisos, the pleasure garden maintained for the great king's visits, and burn the stores of grain collected for Persian campaigns. The message is unmistakable. The silver coins that once displayed the Persian galley now carry symbols of defiance. Artaxerxes responds with the full weight of empire. He assembles an army that ancient sources number at 300,000, certainly exaggerated, but the force is vast, drawn from every satrapy. The march south along the coast is deliberate, designed to terrify. City after city submits before the army arrives. Tennis, watching the approach, attempts negotiation. According to Diodorus Siculus, he offers to betray his own city in exchange for personal safety, surrendering the positions of the walls, the disposition of defenders, the entry points most vulnerable to assault. The betrayal, if Diodorus is accurate, does not save him. Artaxerxes executes Tennis once his usefulness expires. The city, stripped of its king's leadership and facing overwhelming numbers, does not surrender. What follows enters the realm of catastrophe that marks certain moments in ancient urban history, moments when a city chooses annihilation over submission. The citizens of Sidon, according to the ancient account, barricade themselves within their walls and set fire to their own city. The flames consume the harbour quarter, the shipyards heavy with cedar and pitch, the warehouses stacked with trade goods, the residential blocks of timber-framed mud brick rising above ashlar foundations. Diodorus reports that 40,000 perish. Men, women, children, slaves, consumed in a conflagration, they themselves ignite rather than face Persian retribution. The number may be inflated, but the destruction is real. Archaeology confirms what the texts describe. Excavations beneath modern Sidon encounter a distinct burn layer, datable to the mid-4th century before the Common Era. Charred cedar beams collapsed across floors, vitrified mud brick fused by intense heat, ashlar blocks cracked and reddened by fire. The destruction is not localized to a single quarter. It spreads across multiple excavated areas, consistent with a city-wide conflagration rather than a targeted military assault on one sector. Artaxerxes sells the ruins. Ancient sources record that speculators purchase the right to sift the ashes for melted gold and silver, the accumulated wealth of generations of maritime trade, reduced to slag and droplets pooled between carbonized timbers. The great king installs a compliant vassal. The city's fleet, or what remains of it, returns to Persian service. Yet Sidon does not die. Within a generation, construction resumes. New walls rise on the old foundations. The harbour receives ships again. The temple of Eshmun in the hills above continues to receive votives. The sacred precinct apparently survives the urban destruction below. The population recovers, though the political confidence of the Persian-era Golden Age never fully returns. When the next great army appears on the coastal road, Macedonian this time, in 333 years, Sidon will remember what defiance cost. The burn layer beneath the streets carries that memory in charcoal and fused stone, a stratum of absolute destruction separating the city that was from the city that would cautiously, painfully, begin again. The next great army arrives in the autumn of 333 before the Common Era. Alexander of Macedon has just shattered the Persian forces at Issus, and Darius III flees eastward, leaving the Levantine coast exposed. The Macedonian columns move south along the narrow plain between mountains and sea, the same road that Egyptian, Assyrian, and Persian armies have marched before. Word travels faster than infantry. Sidon knows what is coming. The city remembers. 18 years have passed since the burning, since the ash of 40,000 settled into the harbour mud. The generation that rebuilt the walls, that cleared the charred rubble and relaid the keystones, still lives. They remember what resistance purchased. And so when Alexander's advance officers reach the outskirts, Sidon opens its gates. There is no siege, no ram strikes the ashlar, no fire consumes the rebuilt granaries. The city that Persian vengeance nearly erased chooses survival with absolute clarity. The contrast with Tyre, 30 kilometers to the south, could not be sharper. Tyre refuses. Alexander spends 7 months constructing a causeway to the island city, then storms it with devastating violence. Sidon watches from its open harbour as Macedonian supply ships shuttle timber and provisions southward for the siege. The decision to submit is vindicated in Tyrian blood. Alexander rewards Sidon's compliance with a gesture both political and theatrical. The existing pro-Persian leadership is swept aside. According to Plutarch and Diodorus, Alexander's general Hephaestion is tasked with selecting a new king. The choice falls upon a man named Abdolonymos, a figure of royal Sidonian lineage who has fallen into poverty, working as a gardener or tending orchards on the city's outskirts. The sources describe him being found watering plants, still ignorant of the transformation about to engulf his life. Whether the story is precisely true or shaped by Hellenistic literary convention, the political logic is clear. Alexander installs a ruler with legitimate dynastic blood, but no existing power base, a king who owes everything to Macedonian patronage. Under Abdolonymos, Sidon enters a new era. The city retains its harbours, its trade networks, its glass furnaces and dye works. But the cultural orientation shifts westward. Greek architectural forms begin appearing alongside Phoenician traditions. The coinage transitions. The language of administration slowly incorporates Greek alongside Phoenician. Sidon becomes a node in Alexander's vast network, and after his death in 323, it passes through the wars of the successors, Ptolemaic, then Seleucid, adapting as it has always adapted. The supreme artifact of this transitional moment is the sarcophagus carved for Abdolonymos himself. Discovered in 1887 by Osman Hamdi Bey in the Ayar necropolis south of the city, it is among the finest works of ancient sculpture ever recovered. Pentelic marble, nearly 3.5 meters long, carved on all 4 sides and both gabled ends with scenes of battle and lion hunting. Alexander himself appears, identifiable by his lion skin helmet, fighting alongside Persian and Sidonian figures in a composition that deliberately bridges conqueror and conquered. Traces of original polychrome paint survive: purple cloaks, red blood, blue sky, golden bridal fittings. The sarcophagus was never a Greek work imposed on a Phoenician king. It was a Sidonian commission that absorbed Greek sculptural mastery into a local tradition of royal burial art, stretching back through Eşmunazar and Tabnit. The sarcophagus now rests in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, its painted surfaces faded but still faintly visible under raking light. It speaks of a city that understood power with rare sophistication, that knew when to fight, when to yield, and how to transform submission into continuity. The harbours remain active. The temple of Eşmun in the hills above continues receiving votives inscribed in Phoenician. The dye vats still stain workers' hands. Sidon has changed masters, but it has not changed its essential nature. It trades, it builds, it buries its kings in stone of extraordinary beauty. The Macedonian moment passes over the city like a wave over harbour rock, reshaping the surface, leaving the foundation intact. The Seleucid centuries reshape the surface of the city, without disturbing its deeper rhythms. After the wars of Alexander's successors divide the eastern Mediterranean, Sidon passes between Ptolemaic and Seleucid control, finally settling under Antioch's authority by the mid-3rd century before the Common Era. The city retains its minting privileges, striking silver tetradrachms that circulate from Cyprus to Mesopotamia. Its harbour continues to function as it has for 2,000 years, receiving timber from the mountain, dispatching manufactured goods westward. But the language of the streets shifts. Greek inscriptions appear alongside Phoenician. The old temple precincts accommodate new dedications. The city absorbs Hellenistic culture not as conquest, but as commerce, another profitable import to be refined and re-exported. It is in this period that something extraordinary emerges from the furnaces of the glassworking quarter. Sidon has produced glass for centuries: core-formed vessels, cast bowls, beads of brilliant colour. But sometime in the 1st century before the Common Era, a revolutionary technique appears along this coast. A craftsman gathers molten glass on the end of a hollow iron pipe and blows. The bubble expands, impossibly thin, translucent as water. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, attributes the invention of glass blowing to the region of Sidon. The archaeological record confirms dense concentrations of glass workshop debris, furnace fragments, moils, failed vessels, raw glass chunks, in strata dating to this period. The technique transforms glass from a luxury into an everyday material, and Sidonian workshops export their wares across the Roman world. The city's intellectual life proves equally generative. Around 100 before the Common Era, Zeno of Sidon leads the Epicurean school in Athens, lecturing on logic, rhetoric, and the philosophy of nature. Cicero attends his lectures. Sidon produces not only goods, but ideas: mathematicians, poets, legal scholars who carry the city's name into the intellectual centers of the Mediterranean. When Rome absorbs the Seleucid East, Sidon negotiates its position with characteristic precision. The city receives the status of a free city, retaining internal autonomy and the right to mint bronze coinage. Roman-era construction transforms the urban fabric. A colonnaded cardo cuts through the city centre, its granite columns imported from Egypt, its paving stones worn smooth by generations of foot traffic. A hippodrome stretches along the southern edge of the settlement. Public baths with hippocaust heating and mosaic floors serve a population that now numbers in the tens of thousands. The harbour receives new quay walls faced in ashlar limestone. Yet beneath the Roman veneer, older continuities persist. The temple of Eshmun in the hills above still receives votives. Phoenician language inscriptions appear as late as the 1st century of the Common Era. The dye industry continues. Murex shells accumulate in the same middens that have grown for a millennium. Glass workshops cluster near the harbour where sand and natron arrive by ship. The smell of the city in this era is furnace heat and sea salt, molten glass and cedar smoke from the bathhouse fuel stores, the mineral tang of dye vats operating as they have since the Iron Age. The mosaic pavements of Roman Sidon survive in fragments, geometric patterns, marine scenes, mythological figures rendered in tiny tesserae of local limestone and imported marble. They speak of a city comfortable in its wealth, confident in its continuity. Coins minted here in the 2nd century of the Common Era still depict the war galley, the same symbol that appeared on Persian period issues 700 years earlier. The image persists because the reality persists. Sidon remains what it has always been, a harbour city whose wealth flows from the transformation of raw materials into objects the world desires. The material changes, from purple dye to blown glass, from carved ivory to philosophical treatises, but the essential function endures. The city trades, the furnaces burn, the harbour never closes. But the living city is only half of Sidon's story. Beyond the walls, cut into the soft limestone ridges that rise east and south of the harbour settlement, lies another city entirely. A city of the dead, vast and silent, accumulating its population across 7 centuries with the same patient persistence that marks everything Sidonian. The necropolis begins where the agricultural plain meets the first low hills. Shaft tombs descend vertically through the rock, opening at the bottom into rectangular chambers sealed with heavy slabs. The earliest of these date to the 5th century before the Common Era, contemporary with the Persian period Golden Age, and they contain a form of burial art found nowhere else in the ancient world with such concentration. The anthropoid sarcophagus. Carved from white marble imported from the Greek islands, Paros, Pentelicon, perhaps Thasos, these coffins bear human faces sculpted in a style that hovers between Egyptian rigidity and Greek naturalism. The eyes are open, the lips are closed. Each face is slightly different, suggesting individual portraiture or at least the aspiration toward it. The bodies below the neck dissolve into smooth, mummy-shaped forms, a memory of the Egyptian anthropoid coffins that inspired the tradition, the same tradition visible in King Tabnit's reused Egyptian sarcophagus from a generation earlier. More than 20 of these marble anthropoid sarcophagi have emerged from Sidon's necropolis over the past century and a half. The finest stand today in the National Museum of Beirut and in Istanbul. Their faces stare outward with an expression that is neither grief nor joy, but something closer to composed attention. The dead watching eternity with the calm of merchants who have seen every port. Deeper in time and deeper underground, the Hellenistic and Roman periods transform the burial tradition. The simple shaft tomb gives way to the hippogrium, a multi-chambered underground complex carved to resemble architecture, with pilasters, cornices, and pediments rendered in living rock. The walls receive painted plaster. At Magharat Abloon, southeast of the ancient city centre, tomb chambers dating to the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era preserve frescoes of extraordinary refinement. Garlands of flowers and fruit hang in painted loops along the upper walls. Architectural elements, columns, entablatures, receding doorways create the illusion of depth on flat surfaces. Mythological scenes appear. The abduction of Persephone, battles between Greeks and Amazons, figures from a cultural vocabulary now thoroughly Hellenized, but applied to a burial tradition that remains distinctly Sidonian in its underground elaboration. The Roman centuries multiply these painted tombs across the ridgeline. Loculi, individual burial slots cut horizontally into chamber walls, accommodate dozens of dead within a single family hypogeum. Grave goods shift with the era. Gold jewelry and carved gemstones in the Hellenistic layers, glass unguentaria and terracotta oil lamps in the Roman strata. The glass vessels placed beside the dead are often products of Sidon's own furnaces, a city burying its people with the very objects that made it wealthy. Georges Contenot's excavations in the early 20th century and the work that followed mapped portions of this underground world, but the necropolis extends far beyond what has been systematically explored. Construction crews cutting foundations for modern buildings still break through into painted chambers. Each discovery confirms the same pattern. Sidon invested as much artistry in housing its dead as in serving its living. The painted ceilings underground mirror the mosaic floors above. The marble faces on the sarcophagi echo the portrait busts in the colonnaded streets. 2 cities occupy the same ground, one in sunlight, one in perpetual dark, and both are unmistakably, persistently Sidonian. The transformation begins quietly. By the 4th century of the Common Era, the temples that once drew pilgrims to Eshmun's sacred pool fall silent. No decree records their closure. The offerings simply thin, the priesthoods dissolve, and new congregations gather in basilicas raised on foundations that still smell of older incense. Christian communities have existed in Sidon since the Apostolic Age. The Acts of the Apostles names the city as a port where Paul found believers. Now those communities inherit the urban fabric. Mosaic floors laid in Byzantine churches echo the geometric precision of Roman pavements beneath them, but the symbols shift. Fish replace tridents, crosses replace caduci. Column drums from dismantled pagan porticos reappear as nave supports. The city does not die between faiths, it metabolizes one into the next. Sidon under Byzantine administration remains a functioning port, a bishopric, a station on the coastal road linking Berytus to Tyre. Its glass workshops still fire their furnaces. Its harbour still receives grain ships. But the earth itself is restless. In 551 of the Common Era, a catastrophic earthquake ruptures the Lebanese coast. The sea withdraws, then returns as a tsunami that sweeps through the low-lying harbour quarter. Berytus is levelled. Sidon suffers grievously, collapsed colonnades, shattered cisterns, harbour infrastructure dragged seaward. Archaeological layers from this period show abrupt rubble fills, hasty repairs in reused stone, a city contracting around its core. Recovery is incomplete when new masters arrive. In 637, Arab armies under the early caliphate take the coastal cities with relatively little resistance. Sidon passes from Byzantine to Islamic rule, and the transition leaves surprisingly faint archaeological traces. Continuity of occupation, gradual conversion, the same harbour serving different flags. The city shrinks further from its Roman-era extent, but persists as a modest port through the Umayyad and Abbasid centuries, its ancient prominence a memory preserved more in texts than in monumental architecture. Then the Franks come. Crusaders seize Sidon in 1110 after a brief siege, and the city becomes the barony of Sajet, a feudal lordship within the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The new rulers find a diminished settlement, its ancient walls largely robbed for later construction, its harbours silted but still serviceable. They build what the site demands: fortification. The sea castle rises on a small rocky island just offshore, connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway of fitted stone. Its towers are constructed from reused ancient columns laid horizontally in the walls, Roman granite shafts becoming Crusader masonry, visible still today. Arrow slits face seaward. A vaulted hall serves as garrison quarters. On the mainland, the land castle commands the eastern approach with heavier walls and a dry moat. In 1253, Louis IX of France personally oversees the strengthening of Sidon's defences during his stay in the Holy Land. Walls are thickened, towers added, the causeway fortified. But the effort cannot hold against the tide turning across the Levant. In 1291, Mamluk forces under Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil sweep the remaining Crusader strongholds from the coast. Sidon falls. The Mamluks deliberately slight the fortifications, pulling down walls, breaking towers, to prevent any future Frankish reoccupation. What remains after 1291 is a town stripped of military pretension, its Crusader shells open to the sky, its ancient layers buried ever deeper beneath medieval and Ottoman accumulation. The sea castle endures as a ruin on its island, waves lapping at columns that once lined Roman streets and now brace Frankish walls. Beneath everything, beneath mosque foundations and Crusader vaults and Byzantine mosaics and Roman pavements, the Phoenician city waits in darkness, its Bronze Age harbours sealed under meters of sediment, its story suspended between the faith of the cross, the call of the crescent, and the patient silence of buried stone. The silence beneath the streets does not last forever. In 1860, a French naval expedition under Ernest Renan arrives on the Lebanese coast with imperial backing and scholarly ambition. Renan's mission to Phoenicie represents the first systematic attempt to document the physical remains of Phoenician civilization. His teams cut trenches at Sidon, Byblos, Tyre, and Aradus, but it is Sidon that yields the most immediate rewards. Workers clear Ottoman-era rubble and medieval fill to expose carved stone, Phoenician inscriptions, and fragments of monumental architecture that no European scholar has seen in situ. Renan sketches, measures, and photographs. He publishes his findings in lavish folio volumes that announce to the learned world what the buried coast conceals. The sarcophagus of Eshmunazar II, already removed in 1855 and shipped to the Louvre, had been the first signal. Renan's expedition confirms that the signal was not anomalous, that beneath every Ottoman house and Crusader foundation lies a deeper city, stratified and immense. 27 years later, in 1887, the Ottoman painter and museum director Osman Hamdi Bey conducts his own excavation in the Ayar necropolis, south of the city. What his workers uncover in the rock-cut chambers surpasses anything Renan found. 17 sarcophagi emerge from the darkness, among them the so-called Alexander sarcophagus, its marble surfaces still bearing traces of original polychrome paint, its relief panels depicting battle and hunt with a vitality that stuns the archaeological world. Beside it, the Lycian sarcophagus, the satrap sarcophagus, the mourning women sarcophagus, each a masterwork spanning centuries of funerary art. Hamdi Bey ships them not to Paris, but to Constantinople, where they become the founding treasures of the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. For the first time, an Ottoman official has claimed the ancient heritage of his own empire's soil. The 20th century brings deeper penetration. In 1963, the French archaeologist Maurice Dunant begins systematic excavation at Bostan Esh Sheikh, the hillside sanctuary of Eshmun above the Awali River. Season after season, his teams expose the terraced podium walls, the sacred pool, the marble throne of Astarte, and the tribune with its sculptural frieze blending Greek and Phoenician iconography. Dunant works for decades, peeling back Hellenistic and Persian layers to reach the sanctuary's Iron Age foundations. The site reveals votive deposits, terracotta figurines of children, stone baby sculptures offered to the healing god, that illuminate Phoenician religious practice with an intimacy no text provides. Beneath the modern city of Sidon itself, the challenge is different. Streets, apartment blocks, mosques, and markets sit directly atop the ancient tell. No large-scale open excavation is possible. Beginning in 1998, Claude Dumais-Serhal opens a rescue dig at the college site near the old harbour, a narrow window into the tell's stratigraphy. Trench by trench, her team descends through Islamic, Crusader, Byzantine, Roman, Hellenistic, Persian, Iron Age, and finally Middle and Early Bronze Age layers. Egyptian scarabs, Cypriot pottery, Canaanite storage jars, and carbonized grain seeds emerge from contexts dating to the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. Each season confirms that the harbour settlement is older and more continuously occupied than previous scholarship assumed. The paradox of Sidon's archaeology is the paradox of every living ancient city. The modern population, over 200,000 inhabits the same promontory that Chalcolithic fishermen chose 6,000 years ago. Every foundation trench for a new building is a potential excavation. Every water pipe cuts through history. The deepest Phoenician harbour installations remain sealed beneath meters of accumulated sediment and modern concrete. What has been recovered? Sarcophagi, inscriptions, temple architecture, Bronze Age trade goods, represents only fragments drawn from the edges of an enormous buried hole. The stones that Renan first exposed, that Hamdi Bey lifted into museum light, that Dunant painstakingly mapped on the Eshmun hillside, all testify to the same truth. The city that taught the ancient world to trade has never fully revealed itself. It waits still, layered and silent, beneath the footsteps of those who walk its streets today without knowing what lies 1 meter below their shoes. What remains, when the harbours silt and the temples crumble and the painted tombs darken under centuries of earth, is what a city gave away. Sidon's deepest legacy is not what it kept, but what it sent outward, carried in the hulls of ships, pressed into the hands of foreign merchants, absorbed into the fabric of civilizations that never knew the name of the city that had changed them. The purple came first. From crushed murex glands, processed in stone vats along the shore, Sidonian dyers extracted a pigment so color-fast and so luminous that it became the universal marker of sovereignty. Egyptian pharaohs wore it. Assyrian kings demanded it as tribute. Roman senators edged their togas with it. The dye that stained the fingers of Sidonian workers colored the robes of every Mediterranean power for more than 2,000 years, and the industry that produced it, requiring thousands of shells for a single gram of pigment, represented one of antiquity's most sophisticated chemical processes. The word Phoenician itself, from the Greek phoenix, means purple-red. An entire people named for a color born in Sidon's vats. Then the alphabet. Sidon did not invent the Proto-Canaanite script, but Sidonian merchants carried it westward on every trading voyage. The Phoenician letter forms that appear on Sidonian sarcophagi and temple dedications are the direct ancestors of Greek letters, and through Greek of Latin, Cyrillic, and Arabic. Every written sentence in the Western world descends from signs that Sidonian scribes carved into stone and scratched onto papyrus. The transmission was not a single event, but a slow saturation. Letters traveling with cargo, with contracts, with the practical needs of commerce across dozens of ports. And glass. Ancient tradition, recorded by Pliny, credits the Phoenician coast with the discovery of glass blowing, the revolutionary technique that transformed glass from a luxury material into an everyday substance. Sidonian glass workshops of the Roman period produced vessels of astonishing delicacy, translucent and thin-walled, exported across the empire. Whether or not the first breath through a blowpipe occurred precisely at Sidon, the city's glassworkers perfected and disseminated the craft that would shape material culture for millennia. These three gifts, purple dye, alphabetic writing, blown glass, each alone would secure a city's place in the human story. That all three flowed from the same narrow strip of coast, from the same double harbour fed by the same limestone springs, speaks to something in the nature of the place itself. Sidon's geography made it a hinge between worlds. The Cedar Mountains behind, the open sea ahead, Egypt to the south, Mesopotamia to the east, the Aegean to the west. Everything passed through, and in passing through, everything was transformed. Today, the modern city of Sidon presses down on its own past. Apartment blocks stand on Phoenician foundations. Market streets follow the lines of ancient lanes. The sea washes against harbour rocks worn smooth by 4,000 years of keels and ropes and tidal surge. In the Louvre, the sarcophagus of Eshmunazar II still bears its curse against those who would disturb the dead. In Istanbul, the Alexander sarcophagus preserves traces of the paint that once made its marble figures blaze with color. In Beirut, anthropoid coffins stare upward with faces carved to resemble the sleepers within. These scattered stones and objects are fragments of a single enormous story, a story that remains largely buried, largely unread, waiting beneath the footsteps of a city that has never stopped being alive. The harbour still faces the sea. The springs still flow beneath the rock. And somewhere below the surface, sealed under meters of sediment and concrete and time, the oldest layers of one of humanity's most consequential cities hold their silence, not empty, but full, patient, unfinished. Thank you for joining this journey through the deep past of one of the ancient world's greatest cities. If these stories of lost harbours and buried temples have moved you, consider subscribing so you never miss the next voyage into the world that shaped our own.